Now, before we jump into the course, I'd like to give you a little overview of the topics we're going to talk about, kind of where we're headed, and just kind of provide you a roadmap of what you can expect as we work through C++ here. We're going to start off with a little C++ history. It always helps to understand how the technology you're working with kind of developed and evolved and got to where you are. It can really help you understand some of the concepts that you see a little bit later on, because usually most of us in the development world have a history with other programming languages, and when you can find these little correlations to other languages, it can really flatten your learning curve. Then from there, after history, we're going to talk about C++ standards, what they are, what they mean, how they're going to affect you. Then we're going to talk specifically about Visual C++ 2010 Express. This is the free version for developing C++. It's an integrated development environment. It's from Microsoft. We will use this one throughout the class. I didn't choose it because it's necessarily the best. Trying to choose the best development environments like trying to choose the best music. Everybody has a different opinion for different reasons, but this one is an excellent one by anybody's measurements. It is free. It's very easy to get. It's from Microsoft. It installs usually without any hassles, and so it gets us all on the same page quickly. Then we're going to jump into the C++ essentials. We're going to talk about C++, C++ and the CLI, or the Common Language Runtime, all that kind of stuff in the Microsoft world and the differences between the two. Then we'll talk a little bit about program structures in C++, Windows C++, all those little issues that are out there, the little nuances that trip people up. Then we'll jump into program structure, and we will talk about how your C++ programs are organized, how they run, what you need to know when you begin programming these things. Then we'll jump into the basics. We're going to talk about variables, our data types, constants, increment and decrement operators, calculation sequences, duration, scope, and all those things. And then from there we'll jump into pointers, or what's also called indirect data access. Pointers are a big part of C++. They just absolutely confuse us to no end if we've never worked with them before, and so we'll go through pointers and do some examples there. Then, of course, along with pointers, references. Then we'll take a look at control structures. Control structures, we're talking about things like if statements, then statements, loops, the do-while loop and the for loop and all that sort of thing. And that's really part and parcel what programming is about. You're trying to manipulate things in memory based on conditions. From there we'll jump into functions, another major portion of any C++ program. We'll talk about function prototypes, arguments, overloading, pointers as arguments, all those sorts of things. I'll touch on exceptions just a little bit. Exceptions can get really deep really quickly, but I want to give you a foundation to start with on exceptions. From there we'll talk about arrays, some of the basics of arrays, and we'll use that as a springboard for jumping on to containers later. Then I'll talk about object-oriented programming. This is a must understand to be efficient in almost any language nowadays, but especially C++. And we'll talk about understanding classes, how to define a class, creating objects from classes, or instantiating objects. Then we'll talk about constructors and destructors and unions and structs and so forth. From there we'll touch on inheritance, just enough to help you really understand what inheritance is. A lot of examples through all this stuff, very simple examples that will help you get your head wrapped around what's going on here. Then we'll talk about virtual functions. Sounds very funky, but it's pretty straightforward, really cool stuff. And then we'll jump on containers, and we'll concentrate on the vector container. There's a bunch of different containers, but we're going to concentrate on the vector to let you see. And these are really arrays with a lot more bells and whistles and pre-programmed functionality. So anyway, then we'll close it out and talk about how to get to the next level and so forth. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff, and so let's just jump into it and get busy.